could you describe in a little bit more detail how the invasion would actually unfold, based on the war game that you had in the base scenario, from basically the Chinese preemptive attack, the involvement of allies in the region, and sort of what would happen step by step?
Every game was different, but there was a certain pattern that emerged. The Chinese landed in the south, not the north. The north, of course, has the capital and many of the large cities and much of the industry, but the Taiwanese have most of their combat power in the north. So the Chinese tended to land in the south where it was easier to get ashore. A couple of times the Chinese player tried to land in the north. It was very difficult to establish themselves. So they land in the south and then they try to build up combat capability there. The Chinese fleet divides into two pieces. One piece escorts the amphibious ships from the mainland to Taiwan to land the troops. The bulk of the fleet forms a picket line to the east of Taiwan to protect the amphibious ships from attack by U.S. aircraft and cruise missiles. The amphibious ships are the center of gravity, the key element, because if they get destroyed, then regardless of what other capabilities the Chinese have, they cannot get forces onto Taiwan and they lose. So they work hard to protect those amphibious ships, and the U.S. player and coalition work hard to get at those amphibious ships. I mentioned earlier that the assumption on Japan was that they would let the U.S. use its bases but would not participate themselves unless the Chinese attacked Japanese territory. In about 20 games out of the 25, the Chinese did do that. What they found was that the U.S. was building combat power on its bases, and those were operating with impunity. And at some point, they decided to attack those bases. When they did, they destroyed a lot of aircraft on the ground, but they also figured that if they were going to attack the United States and bring the Japanese into the conflict, they might as well attack the Japanese also. So the Chinese typically attack the United States and Japanese forces at the same time in a massive missile attack. It's interesting to note that this received a tremendous amount of attention in Japan. The game, for example, spawned a 1-hour TV special as the Japanese discussed it and analyzed it. And the reason it got so much attention was that it showed that the decision about war and peace for Japan was going to be made in Beijing and Washington, not in Tokyo. That the Japanese would be brought into the war based on what the Chinese decided and the United States decided. And that was quite a shock. They had assumed that they would have the choice whether to enter the conflict or not. Typical games also entailed a lot of U.S. aircraft losses on the ground. The reason was that the Chinese have a lot of missiles, but the United States needs to move its aircraft in close if they're going to strike at the Chinese fleet and fly over Taiwan. So what happens is you have successive waves of U.S. fighter attack aircraft going forward, being destroyed by Chinese missiles, more aircraft going forward. The games were typically a race between U.S. efforts to destroy Chinese amphibious ships and the Chinese efforts to land forces on the island and take over a port or airfield to bring in more forces. They typically lost that race because the United States was able to get at the Chinese amphibious ships, but that came at very high cost as they kept on pushing more fighter aircraft forward, and these fighter aircraft kept being destroyed on the ground. One of the recommendations that we make is that the United States and Japan build more hardened shelters and expand their capability for distributed operations to reduce the vulnerability of these aircraft.
But the Chinese are able to land at least some forces in Taiwan.
The Chinese are always able to land some forces on Taiwan. Their military capabilities at this point are such that the Taiwanese cannot defeat them in the straits. Now, that has been their strategy for 70 years, and for a long time, it was a reasonable strategy. And it's still reasonable to be able to strike the Chinese in the straits, but they have too much combat power now to be completely defeated before they land. It's worth noting two other aspects of the games that ran through all of the iterations. One was the value of U.S. submarines. They would move into the straits and wreak havoc on the Chinese fleet. We called it the happy time for U.S. submarines. The problem was there just weren't enough of them. They would expend all of their munitions and they would have to go back and reload. The other thing was how useful bombers armed with long-range cruise missiles were. They could be based outside of the Chinese defensive bubble. They could launch their missiles before they got inside Chinese air defenses, and those missiles then would attack the Chinese fleet. The problem the U.S. had was that its inventory of anti-ship cruise missiles is very small and was expended in the first couple of days. One of the major recommendations, and something the Pentagon has picked up on, is the need to expand those inventories.
And then the game basically ends with most of the Chinese Navy eventually being destroyed, and the forces that were able to land on Taiwan are then eliminated, and China is not able to bring further reinforcements. And that basically concludes the war game and the conflict.
Yes. Now, when we finish the play at about 3 or 4 weeks, the Chinese are still ashore in Taiwan. Their problem is that they have lost so many amphibious ships that they cannot expand their forces and are having difficulty sustaining them. So as we project ahead, it's clear that those forces would eventually be defeated and destroyed. And that's one of the reasons that we raise the question about the stability of the Chinese Communist Party if they suffer such a defeat. They would see thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Chinese prisoners on Taiwan being paraded through the streets of Taipei, and it's not clear they could sustain that kind of international humiliation.